My husband never let our daughter visit my mom, and when I finally discovered why, I filed for divorce. I was born and raised in California, where family meant everything, and my mother had always been the heart of our tight-knit circle. When I married David, I thought I'd found someone who shared those same values. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect. We had a beautiful daughter named Emma, and life felt like it was falling into place exactly as I had always dreamed. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because what started as small excuses would unravel into a betrayal I never saw coming. The first time David suggested that Emma shouldn't visit my mom was when our daughter was about 3 years old. My mother had called, excited about having Emma over for the weekend. She wanted to bake cookies with her granddaughter and take her to the park near her house. It was something she had been looking forward to for weeks. When I told David about the plan, his face changed. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat before finally saying that he thought Emma was too young to spend the night away from home. It seemed like a reasonable concern at the time. Emma was still quite little, and maybe he was just being protective. I suggested that I could stay with them, but David quickly said that if I went, then there was no point in my mom having special grandmother time. He made it sound so logical, so I agreed to postpone. Months passed, and my mother would ask again. Each time, David had a new reason. Emma had a cold coming on. There was a birthday party that weekend. He had planned a family outing that he forgot to mention. The excuses kept coming, one after another, and I started to notice a pattern. Every single time my mother wanted to spend time alone with Emma, David found a way to prevent it. At first, I tried to dismiss my growing unease. Maybe he really was just being cautious. Maybe he wanted to maximize our family time together, but deep down something felt wrong. The way he tensed up whenever my mother's name came up in conversation. The way he would quickly change the subject if I mentioned planning a visit. It was subtle, but it was there. I started paying closer attention to how David interacted with my mother during family gatherings. He was polite, always cordial, but there was a distance that I had never really noticed before. When my mom would reach for Emma, David would find reasons to keep our daughter close. He would suggest activities that required parental supervision or suddenly remember something we needed to do. My mother noticed too. I could see the hurt in her eyes when David would interrupt her time with Emma. She never said anything directly to me, but I knew it bothered her. She had always been so excited about being a grandmother, and now she was being kept at arm's length from her only grandchild. By the time Emma was 5, the situation had become impossible to ignore. My mother had invited us all to her house for Thanksgiving. It was a tradition we had maintained since I was a child, and I assumed we would continue it. David initially agreed, but as the date approached, he started making comments about how stressful holiday travel was. He suggested we start our own traditions at home. When I pushed back, reminding him that my mother would be heartbroken if we didn't come, he reluctantly agreed to go, but he made it clear he wasn't happy about it. The entire drive to my mother's house, he was tense and quiet. When we arrived, he was polite but distant, spending most of the day on his phone or watching television. He barely spoke to my mother, and when she asked if Emma could help her in the kitchen, David insisted that he wanted Emma to stay with him in the living room. I pulled David aside that evening and asked him directly what was going on. Why was he being so cold to my mother? Why wouldn't he let Emma spend time with her grandmother? He looked at me like I was being ridiculous. He said I was imagining things, that he had been perfectly pleasant all day. He accused me of being overly sensitive and said that maybe I was projecting my own issues onto him. The conversation went nowhere. He refused to acknowledge that there was any problem, and I was left feeling frustrated and confused. Was I seeing things that weren't there? Was I being unfair to him? But then I would remember the countless times he had blocked my mother from spending time with Emma, and I knew I wasn't imagining it. The following year brought more of the same pattern. My mother's birthday came and went without Emma being allowed to stay overnight. Christmas was spent at our house, with my mother invited but clearly not welcome to have any real time alone with her granddaughter. Easter, summer vacation, every opportunity was met with resistance from David. I tried to compensate by visiting my mother more often with Emma during the day, but David always found excuses to cut those visits short. He would call, saying he needed me home for something. He would text that Emma had activities she needed to get ready for. The visits that should have lasted hours were reduced to mere minutes, and my mother's disappointment grew more evident each time. My sister noticed the tension during a family barbecue at my mother's house. She pulled me aside and asked why David seemed so uncomfortable around our mom. I didn't know what to tell her. I didn't have an answer that made sense. I mumbled something about him being stressed at work, but she didn't buy it. She suggested that maybe there had been some kind of argument or misunderstanding between David and my mother that I didn't know about. That possibility had never occurred to me. Could something have happened that I was completely unaware of? I decided to ask my mother directly if David had ever said or done anything to upset her. She seemed surprised by the question and assured me that she couldn't think of anything. She said David had always been respectful, if a bit distant. I was at a loss. Nothing added up. David had no reasonable explanation for his behavior, and neither my mother nor my sister could shed any light on what might be causing it. I started to wonder if David had some deeper issue with my family that he wasn't sharing. Maybe he felt like I was too close to my mother. Maybe he resented the time I spent with her, but that didn't explain why he was specifically preventing Emma from visiting. If he had a problem with my mother, why take it out on their grandmother-granddaughter relationship? The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. There was clearly something going on beneath the surface, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Emma was now 7 years old, and she had started asking questions. She wanted to know why she couldn't go to Grandma's house by herself like her friends got to visit their grandparents. She didn't understand why Daddy always said no when Grandma invited her over. I tried to explain it away with vague responses about scheduling and timing, but Emma was getting old enough to see through those excuses. She knew something was wrong, even if she didn't fully understand what. The guilt I felt was overwhelming. I was allowing my husband to damage the relationship between my daughter and my mother, and I didn't even know why. I felt caught between loyalty to my husband and protecting my mother and daughter. Every day the tension grew worse. One afternoon I decided to test a theory. I told David that my mother had invited Emma to spend Saturday with her, but I deliberately didn't mention anything about overnight. I said my mom wanted to take Emma to a children's museum and then out for lunch. It was just a few hours during the day, and I would pick Emma up in the late afternoon. David's reaction was immediate and telling. He said absolutely not. When I asked why, he stumbled over his words, finally landing on the excuse that he had wanted to take Emma to a movie that day. I pointed out that he hadn't mentioned any such plan before, and he got defensive. He said he shouldn't have to clear every family activity with me in advance. The conversation devolved into an argument, and in the end, Emma didn't go to see my mother. That fight was a turning point for me. David's response had been too strong, too immediate for such a simple request. There was no rational reason to prevent a daytime visit to the museum. His reaction confirmed what I had been suspecting for years. This wasn't about protecting Emma or managing our schedule. This was about something else entirely. David was actively working to keep my mother away from our daughter, and he was willing to lie and create conflict to do it. I needed to understand why. I needed to know what could possibly justify this years-long campaign to isolate Emma from her grandmother. The not knowing was eating me alive, and I made a decision that I would get to the bottom of this no matter what it took. I started by going through David's things when he wasn't home. I know it sounds terrible, and I felt guilty doing it, but I was desperate for answers. I looked through his office, his drawers, his computer files. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for. Some evidence of conflict with my mother? A diary entry explaining his feelings? Anything that might give me a clue. I found nothing. His computer was password protected beyond the main login, and his physical papers were mostly work-related documents and bills. There were no hidden letters, no secret correspondence, nothing that pointed to any issue with my mother. If anything, the lack of evidence made the situation more frustrating. Whatever David's reason was, he was keeping it completely hidden. Next, I tried a more direct approach. I sat down with my mother and asked her to really think back through every interaction she had ever had with David. Was there any moment, any comment, any situation that might have caused a problem? She thought about it carefully and told me about the usual family dynamics. She said that when David and I first started dating, she had expressed some concerns that we were moving too fast. We got engaged after only 8 months, and she had suggested we take more time. David knew about her reservations, but he had never seemed bothered by them. In fact, he had worked hard to win her over, bringing her flowers and spending time getting to know her. By the time we actually got married, she fully supported our relationship. She couldn't think of anything since then that would have created tension. I considered the possibility that David held a grudge about my mother's initial hesitation, but that seemed like such a stretch. It had been years ago, and she had come around completely. Besides, if he was upset about something that happened before we were married, why wait until after Emma was born to start creating distance? The timeline didn't make sense. Whatever triggered David's behavior had to be something that happened after Emma came into our lives. I racked my brain trying to remember any incident, any conversation, any moment that stood out. But everything seemed normal in my memories. The change in David's behavior had been gradual, not sudden, which made it even harder to pinpoint a cause. I decided to enlist my sister's help. I explained the full extent of what had been happening over the years, how David had systematically prevented Emma from having a relationship with our mother. My sister was shocked. She had noticed some tension, but she had no idea it was this deliberate and sustained. She agreed to help me investigate. Her first suggestion was that maybe David had some trauma or bad experience related to grandparents that he had never told me about. Maybe his own relationship with his grandparents had been difficult, and he was projecting that onto Emma's relationship with my mother. It was a possibility I hadn't considered, but when I thought about it, I realized David had always spoken fondly of his grandparents. They had both passed away before we met, but he had good memories of them. My sister's second theory was darker. She wondered if David might be hiding something about himself, something that he was afraid my mother would discover if she spent too much time with Emma. The suggestion made my stomach turn. What could David possibly be hiding that my mother would uncover through spending time with a child? The implications were disturbing, and I didn't want to believe it. But I also couldn't ignore the possibility. I had exhausted all the reasonable explanations. Maybe the truth was something I didn't want to face. My sister urged me to be careful and to consider that David's behavior might be protecting a secret that could change everything. That conversation planted a seed of real fear in my mind. I started looking at David differently, noticing things I had overlooked before. He was often secretive with his phone. He had a separate email account that he said was for work, but I had never actually seen him use it for work purposes. He took calls in other rooms and would sometimes disappear for hours on weekends, claiming he was running errands or meeting colleagues. I had always trusted him completely, but now every little thing seemed suspicious. Was I being paranoid, or was I finally seeing clearly? The doubt was agonizing. This was my husband, the father of my child, the man I had built a life with. I didn't want to believe he was hiding something terrible. I knew I needed more concrete information before jumping to conclusions. I decided to hire a private investigator. It felt like a drastic step, like something out of a television show, but I was out of options. I contacted a local firm and explained that I needed someone to look into my husband's activities and background. I gave them all the information I had, including my concerns about his behavior regarding my mother and Emma. The investigator I spoke with was professional and non-judgmental. He explained that he would conduct a thorough check of David's activities, finances, and background to see if there was anything unusual. He warned me that what he found might not be what I wanted to hear, but that I deserved to know the truth. Waiting for the investigator's report was torture. Every day felt like a year. I tried to act normal around David, but it was difficult. I found myself analyzing everything he said and did, looking for clues. He noticed that I was distracted and asked if I was feeling okay. I blamed it on stress at work and hormones, anything to deflect. I couldn't let him know what I was doing. If there really was something wrong, I needed to find out what it was before he had a chance to cover it up. Emma asked me several times why I seemed sad, and I had to put on a brave face for her. I told her everything was fine, even though inside I was falling apart. The investigator called me 3 weeks later and asked to meet in person. My heart was pounding as I drove to his office. The receptionist led me to a small conference room where the investigator was waiting with a thick folder. He looked serious, and I knew immediately that he had found something significant. He started by saying that he wanted to prepare me for some difficult information. Then he opened the folder and began laying out documents on the table. What he showed me was something I could never have anticipated, something that changed my entire understanding of my marriage and my husband. David had a criminal record, not under his current name, but under a previous identity. Before I met him, before he moved to California, he had lived in Nevada under a slightly different version of his name. There, he had been involved in a serious incident involving fraud and identity theft. He had served a short jail sentence and had been on probation for several years. When he moved to California, he had legally changed his name, not drastically, but enough that a casual background check wouldn't connect the two identities. He had essentially reinvented himself, leaving his criminal past behind. The investigator explained that this kind of thing was more common than people realized, and that David had done it carefully and legally, which was why it hadn't come up before. My mind was reeling. I had been married to this man for nearly a decade, and I had no idea he had a criminal history. He had lied to me from the very beginning, creating an entirely false backstory about his life before we met. I felt sick. But the investigator wasn't done. He explained that the fraud case David had been involved in was particularly relevant to my situation. David had been part of a scheme that targeted elderly people. He and his accomplices had posed as financial advisors and had convinced senior citizens to invest their savings in fake investment opportunities. Multiple older adults had lost significant amounts of money, and one woman had lost nearly everything she had. It was a predatory, cruel crime that had devastated vulnerable people. Suddenly, everything made sense. David wasn't keeping Emma away from my mother because of any current conflict or tension. He was keeping them apart because he was terrified that my mother would somehow recognize him or trigger memories of his past. Or perhaps he was afraid that if he spent too much time around my mother, she would somehow sense that something was off about him. Maybe he worried that Emma might say something innocent that would lead to questions about David's background. Whatever the specific fear was, the connection was clear. David had targeted elderly people in his past, and now he was deliberately avoiding having a meaningful relationship with an elderly member of his own family. He was protecting his secret by keeping distance between his past crimes and his current life. I sat in that office for a long time, staring at the documents spread across the table. The investigator gave me space to process what I was learning. Finally, I asked him if he was absolutely certain about all of this. He assured me that everything was verified. He had court records, police reports, and documentation of the name change. There was no doubt. He also told me that while David had completed his sentence in probation, the nature of his crimes suggested a willingness to deceive and manipulate people, especially vulnerable people. He recommended that I think carefully about what this meant for my marriage and for my daughter's safety. I left that office in a daze. I drove around aimlessly for hours, trying to figure out what to do with this information. My husband was not who I thought he was. Our entire relationship was built on lies. Every story he had told me about his past, every detail about his family and his history, I now had to question all of it. How much of what I knew about David was even true? And more importantly, what did this mean for Emma and me? Was he dangerous? The investigator had said there was no evidence of any violent behavior, and the crimes he committed were about financial exploitation, not physical harm. But the fact remained that he was willing to lie, to manipulate, and to prey on vulnerable people. Now, this is where I did file for divorce, that I want you to advise me if I was right or wrong. I couldn't stay married to someone who had hidden such a significant part of his past from me. The lying was bad enough, but the nature of his crimes made it impossible for me to trust him around my mother. How could I expose her to someone who had specifically targeted people like her in the past? Even if he had changed, even if he had truly left that life behind, he had made the choice not to tell me. He had decided that keeping his secret was more important than being honest with his wife. That betrayal cut deeper than anything else. I felt like I had been living with a stranger. Before confronting David, I needed to make sure I had all my ducks in a row. I consulted with a divorce attorney and explained the situation. The attorney advised me to document everything, to make copies of all the investigators' findings, and to open my own bank account that David didn't have access to. She helped me understand my rights regarding custody of Emma and division of assets. I followed her instructions carefully. I gathered financial documents, made lists of our shared property, and prepared myself for the confrontation that was coming. I also confided in my sister, showing her all the evidence the investigator had provided. She was horrified but supportive. She offered to be there when I talked to David, but I decided I needed to do this alone. The day I confronted David was one of the hardest days of my life. I waited until Emma was at school and then asked David to sit down with me in the living room. I told him I had hired an investigator and that I knew everything. The look on his face was something I will never forget. It was a mix of panic, anger, and resignation. For a moment he tried to deny it, but when I started laying out specific details, names, dates, and court case numbers, He realized there was no point in continuing the lie. He slumped back in his chair and put his head in his hands. The mask he had been wearing for all these years finally fell away. What followed was a long and painful conversation. David admitted to everything. He confirmed that he had been involved in the fraud scheme, that he had served time, and that he had changed his name and moved to California to start over. He said he had been young and stupid, that he had fallen in with the wrong people, and that he deeply regretted what he had done. He claimed he had changed, that he was a different person now. When I asked him why he never told me, he said he was afraid. He was afraid that if I knew the truth, I would leave him. He said he had fallen in love with me and couldn't bear the thought of losing me over mistakes he made in his past. He thought that if he could just keep it hidden long enough, it would stay buried forever. I asked him directly about my mother. I asked him if his past was the reason he had been keeping Emma away from her. He was quiet for a long time before finally admitting that yes, that was the reason. He said he was terrified that spending time with an elderly woman would somehow expose him. He wasn't sure how or why, but the fear was there. He said he also felt intense guilt and shame whenever he was around my mother, because she reminded him of the people he had hurt. He couldn't look at her without thinking about the elderly woman who had lost her savings because of him. So he had created distance, telling himself it was for the best, even though he knew it was hurting everyone involved. Hearing him admit it didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made things worse. He had let his fear and shame damage the relationship between my daughter and her grandmother. He had allowed my mother to feel rejected and hurt for years, all to protect himself. He had put his own comfort above the well-being of his family. I told him that I couldn't forgive that. I told him that I was filing for divorce and that I wanted him to move out of the house immediately. He begged me to reconsider. He said he would do anything to make it right. He offered to go to therapy, to tell my mother the truth himself, to do whatever it took to rebuild trust. But I was done. The foundation of our marriage was gone. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. David moved out within a week. I sat Emma down and explained in terms she could understand that Daddy and I were going to be living in separate houses from now on. She was devastated. She cried and asked if it was her fault. I assured her that it had nothing to do with her, that sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are hard but necessary. I didn't tell her about her father's past. That was a conversation for when she was much older. For now, she just needed to know that both her parents loved her and that we would work together to make sure she was okay. It was heartbreaking to see her so sad, and I questioned whether I was doing the right thing. But then I would remember the lies, the manipulation, the years of damage, and I knew I had made the only choice I could. My mother was confused when I told her that David and I were separating. She asked what had happened, and I struggled with how much to tell her. Eventually, I decided she deserved to know the truth. I sat down with her and my sister and told them everything the investigator had found. I explained David's criminal past, his fraud against elderly people, and his real reason for keeping Emma away all these years. My mother's reaction was complicated. She was hurt and angry on my behalf, but she also seemed almost relieved to finally understand what had been going on. She told me that she had always felt like David was hiding something, but she could never put her finger on what it was. Now it all made sense. The divorce process was difficult and drawn out. David contested many of my requests, particularly regarding custody of Emma. He argued that his past crimes had nothing to do with his ability to be a good father, and that I was being vindictive by trying to limit his time with our daughter. His lawyer painted me as someone who couldn't forgive a mistake made years ago, someone who was punishing David for something he had already paid for legally. It was frustrating and exhausting. My lawyer countered by emphasizing the pattern of deception and the fact that David had deliberately damaged Emma's relationship with her grandmother to protect his secret. We argued that someone willing to lie for so long and to manipulate family dynamics so thoroughly was not demonstrating the honesty and integrity required for equal custody. In the end, we reached a settlement. I got primary custody of Emma, and David got visitation rights. He was required to attend counseling and to be honest with Emma about his past when she was old enough to understand. The house and most of our shared assets were divided, and I walked away from the marriage financially stable enough to start over. But the emotional cost was enormous. I felt like I had lost years of my life to a lie. I had wasted nearly a decade with someone who wasn't who he claimed to be. My trust in people was shattered. How could I ever be sure that someone was telling me the truth when the person I had been closest to had fooled me so completely? Emma struggled with the divorce. She missed having both parents in the same house. She didn't understand why things had to change so dramatically. I did my best to support her, enrolling her in counseling to help her process her feelings. David remained involved in her life through his scheduled visitations, and I had to learn to co-parent with someone I no longer trusted. It was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Every time I handed Emma over to him, I worried, not that he would harm her physically, but that he would fill her head with his version of events, that he would try to turn her against me or against my mother. So far, that hasn't happened, but the fear is always there. The relationship between Emma and my mother slowly began to heal once the barriers were removed. With David out of the picture, there was no longer anyone preventing them from spending time together. My mother started having Emma over for weekends and school breaks. They baked together, went to museums, and did all the grandmother-granddaughter activities that David had stolen from them for so many years. Watching them bond was bittersweet. I was happy to see them finally connecting, but I was also angry about all the time that had been lost. Emma was now 8 years old, and she had missed out on years of memories with her grandmother because of David's selfishness and fear. My extended family's reaction to the divorce was mixed. My sister was entirely supportive. She had never fully trusted David anyway, and she was glad that I had discovered the truth before wasting any more years with him. My mother, of course, supported my decision completely, but some other family members were less understanding. A few aunts and uncles thought I was being too harsh. They argued that everyone makes mistakes and that David deserved a second chance. They said I should have tried counseling or given him an opportunity to prove he had changed. These comments hurt, but I stood firm in my decision. They hadn't lived through years of lies. They hadn't watched their child be kept away from her grandmother for no reason they could understand. They hadn't felt the betrayal of discovering that their entire marriage was built on deception. David's family was even more complicated. His parents had moved to California a few years after we got married, and I had developed a decent relationship with them. When I told them about the divorce, I initially didn't share all the details about David's past, but David ended up telling them himself, spinning the story in a way that made him look like a victim of my inability to forgive. His mother called me, angry and defensive. She accused me of ruining her son's life over something that happened before I even knew him. She said I was being cruel and unfair. When I tried to explain that it wasn't just about his past, but about the years of lying and manipulation, she didn't want to hear it. Our relationship was destroyed. David's father was quieter, but clearly sided with his son. I lost my in-laws, and Emma lost her paternal grandparents in any meaningful sense. Money became a source of ongoing conflict. Although we had a divorce settlement, David was often late with child support payments. He claimed that his job situation was unstable, that he was struggling financially. I suspected he was being difficult on purpose, punishing me for leaving him. I had to involve my lawyer multiple times to enforce the payment schedule. Each time was a hassle and added to my stress. I was working full-time, raising Emma primarily on my own, and dealing with an ex-husband who seemed determined to make things as difficult as possible. There were days when I felt completely overwhelmed, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake by leaving him. But then I would remember why I left. I would remember the investigator's folder full of evidence. I would remember the years my mother spent being rejected and hurt because David was protecting his secret. I would remember the feeling of discovering that my entire marriage was a lie, and I would know that despite how hard things were, I had made the right choice. I couldn't stay with someone who had been fundamentally dishonest with me. I couldn't expose my mother to someone with his history. I couldn't model for Emma that it was acceptable to stay in a relationship where trust had been completely destroyed. Leaving was the right thing to do, even if it was the hardest thing I had ever done. As time passed, I started to rebuild my life. I focused on my career and on being the best mother I could be to Emma. I reconnected with old friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. I started to rediscover who I was outside of being David's wife. It was a slow process, and there were many setbacks. I went on a few dates, but found it difficult to trust anyone new. How could I open myself up to someone else when the last person I trusted had betrayed me so completely? My sister encouraged me to give it time, to not rush into anything. She said I needed to heal first before I could be ready for a new relationship. She was probably right. Emma continued to see David on a regular schedule, and I had to accept that he would always be part of her life. I couldn't protect her from every disappointment or every difficult truth. As she got older, she would have to learn about her father's past and form her own opinions about him. All I could do was be there for her, answer her questions honestly, and give her the support she needed. I dreaded the day when she would be old enough for David to tell her the full story. What would she think? Would she blame me for divorcing him? Would she understand why I made the choices I did? These questions kept me up at night. My mother, for her part, never said a word against David in front of Emma. Despite everything he had done, despite the years of rejection and hurt, she took the high road. She focused on building a relationship with her granddaughter and didn't try to poison Emma against her father. I admired that about her. I wasn't always sure I could be as graceful. Sometimes when David would drop Emma off late or would make a snide comment, I wanted to lash out. I wanted to remind him of what he had done, of the lies he had told. But I bit my tongue for Emma's sake. She didn't need to be in the middle of her parents' conflict any more than she already was. The first year after the divorce was the hardest. Everything felt raw and uncertain. But gradually life started to settle into a new normal. Emma adjusted to having two houses. I adjusted to being a single parent. My mother thrived in her new role as an actively involved grandmother. We created new traditions and new memories. There was still pain, still anger, still moments when I wondered if I could have handled things differently. But overall, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. I was no longer living a lie. I was no longer married to someone who had deceived me. I was free, even if that freedom came with its own set of challenges. Looking back now, I can see signs that I missed during my marriage. Small things that should have been red flags. The way David was always vague about his past. the way he avoided certain topics or would change the subject when questions got too specific, the way he had no old friends from before he moved to California, no childhood photos, no connection to his previous life. At the time, I had accepted his explanations. He said he wasn't close with his family. He said he had moved around a lot for work. He said he wasn't sentimental about keeping old photos. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I was in love, and I didn't want to see the truth that was hiding just below the surface. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, I would tell her to ask more questions, to push harder when something didn't add up, to trust her instincts when they told her something was wrong. But I also know that hindsight is easy. When you're in the middle of a situation, when you're in love with someone and building a life with them, it's so much harder to see clearly. You want to believe the best about the person you've chosen. You want to trust that they're being honest with you. I can't beat myself up too much for not seeing through David's lies earlier. He was skilled at deception. He had practice. I was just a woman who fell in love with the wrong man. The impact on Emma is something I still worry about constantly. How will this affect her ability to trust people? How will it shape her understanding of relationships? I try to model healthy boundaries and honest communication. I talk to her about the importance of telling the truth, even when it's hard. I hope that as she grows up, she'll learn from what happened and will choose partners who are open and honest with her. But I know that children of divorce carry scars, and I can't protect her from all of them. All I can do is love her, support her, and be there for her no matter what. My own ability to trust has been deeply damaged. I find myself questioning everything now. When someone tells me something about themselves, I wonder if they're lying. When a new friend or potential romantic partner shares their history, I find myself wanting to hire an investigator to verify it. I know this isn't healthy. I know I can't live the rest of my life suspicious of everyone I meet. But the trauma of discovering David's lies runs deep. It will take time, maybe years, to fully heal from it. Therapy has helped. Talking to other people who have been through similar experiences has helped, but there's no quick fix for shattered trust. Some people have asked me if I regret marrying David at all. After all, if I hadn't married him, I wouldn't have Emma, and Emma is the best thing in my life. It's a complicated question. I don't regret Emma for a single second. She's my world, and I would go through everything again if it meant I got to be her mother. But do I regret the years I spent with David? Do I regret the trust I placed in him? Yes. I regret not seeing through him sooner. I regret the time that was wasted. I regret the damage that was done to my relationship with my mother and to Emma's relationship with her grandmother. Those are years we can never get back. David has tried multiple times to reconcile. He sends me long emails explaining how much he's changed, how much he's learned, how sorry he is for everything. He says he's been going to therapy and working on himself. He asks if we can try again, if I can give him another chance. Each time my answer is the same. No, I wish him well. I hope he has genuinely changed for Emma's sake, but I will never be able to trust him again. The foundation is gone. You can't rebuild a house when the foundation has crumbled. You have to start over with something new. That's what I'm doing with my life now. The financial aftermath of the divorce continues to affect me years later. Legal fees were substantial, and starting over as a single parent meant adjusting to a significantly reduced household income. I had to make sacrifices that I never anticipated. We moved to a smaller house in a less expensive neighborhood. Emma had to switch schools, leaving behind friends she had known since kindergarten. I took on extra hours at work to make ends meet, which meant less time with Emma. The guilt of that trade-off weighs on me constantly. I want to be there for every moment of her childhood, but I also need to provide for us financially. It's an impossible balance, and some days I feel like I'm failing at both. Emma's school performance suffered during the transition period. Her grades dropped, and her teachers reported that she seemed distracted and sad. I met with school counselors and worked with her teachers to create a support plan. Slowly, things improved. She made new friends in our new neighborhood. She adjusted to the routine of going back and forth between my house and David's apartment. Kids are resilient, everyone kept telling me, and I had to trust that Emma would be okay. But watching her struggle broke my heart. She hadn't asked for any of this. She was an innocent victim of her father's choices and my decision to end the marriage because of them. My career suffered as well. Before the divorce, I had been on track for a promotion at work. I was excelling in my role and had received positive performance reviews, but the stress of the separation, the divorce proceedings, and single parenting took a toll on my work performance. I started missing deadlines. I was distracted during meetings. I had to take time off for lawyer appointments and court dates. The promotion went to someone else, and I was left feeling like I had lost ground professionally just when I needed financial stability the most. It felt like David's lies were still reaching into every corner of my life, destroying things even after he was gone. Dating again seemed impossible for the longest time. The few times I tried to go out with someone, I found myself unable to open up. I would sit across from a perfectly nice man, and all I could think about was David's deception. How did I know this person was who they said they were? What if they were hiding something terrible? The paranoia made it impossible to form connections. After a few failed attempts, I gave up on dating entirely. I told myself I needed to focus on Emma and on rebuilding my own sense of self. Romance could wait. Maybe it would wait forever. Maybe I was just meant to be alone. As depressing as that thought was, it felt safer than risking my heart again. My relationship with my mother deepened during this time. She became my rock, my confidant, the person I could always count on. She helped me with Emma, picking her up from school when I had to work late, hosting her for dinners and sleepovers. She never once said anything that suggested she blamed me for marrying David or for not seeing through him sooner. She just loved me and supported me through the hardest period of my life. I realized how much I had taken her for granted over the years. David's interference had created distance between us that I hadn't even fully recognized until it was removed. Now we were closer than ever, and I was grateful for her presence in my life and in Emma's life. Emma's relationship with David became increasingly complicated as she got older. She started asking questions about why we got divorced. She wanted to know what had happened between us. I gave her age-appropriate answers, explaining that sometimes adults make mistakes and that those mistakes can hurt the people they love. I didn't go into details about his criminal past. That conversation would come later when she was mature enough to process it. But even my vague explanations seemed to trouble her. She struggled with divided loyalty, loving both of her parents, but sensing that something serious had happened between us. David's girlfriend entered the picture about 2 years after our divorce. Her name was Rachel, and from what Emma told me, she seemed nice enough. David had apparently met her at work. I felt a complicated mix of emotions when I learned he was dating someone new. Part of me was relieved. Maybe if he had someone else in his life, he would stop trying to reconcile with me. But another part of me was worried. Did Rachel know about David's past? Was he lying to her the way he had lied to me? And what did this mean for Emma? Would Rachel be good to my daughter? Or would she be another complication in an already difficult situation? I met Rachel for the first time when she accompanied David to one of Emma's school events. She was younger than me, probably by about 5 years, and she was friendly in a slightly nervous way. After the event, she approached me and introduced herself properly. She said she wanted me to know that she cared about Emma and would never try to replace me as her mother. I appreciated the gesture, even though I wasn't sure I believed her sincerity. Was this woman just being polite, or did she genuinely mean what she said? And more importantly, did she know what she had gotten herself into by dating David? I later learned through Emma that David had not told Rachel about his criminal past. He was repeating the same pattern with her that he had followed with me. He was building a relationship on lies and omissions. I struggled with whether I had any obligation to tell Rachel the truth. On one hand, she deserved to know who she was dating. On the other hand, was it really my place to interfere in David's new relationship? I consulted with my therapist about this ethical dilemma. She pointed out that I had no legal obligation to say anything, and that doing so might create more drama and conflict that could affect Emma. In the end, I decided to stay out of it. Rachel would have to discover the truth on her own, just as I had. Emma turned 10, and with that milestone came new challenges. She was old enough now to have strong opinions about the custody arrangement. She started expressing frustration about having to move between 2 houses. She complained that she never felt fully settled anywhere. At my house, she missed things she had left at her dad's house. At her dad's house, she missed being with me and with her grandmother. The constant back and forth was wearing on her, and I could see it taking a toll on her emotional well-being. I suggested to David that we consider modifying the custody arrangement, but he refused. He insisted that the current schedule was fair and that Emma would adjust. The holidays became particularly difficult. Every year brought new negotiations about who would have Emma for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and other important days. David wanted to split everything equally, which meant Emma often had to spend half of a holiday with one parent and half with the other. It robbed these special days of any sense of tradition or continuity. Emma would be opening presents at my house in the morning and then rushed over to David's house for the afternoon, or she would have Thanksgiving dinner at my mother's house and then have to leave early to have dessert with David's family. She handled it with grace, but I knew it bothered her. She wanted things to be the way they used to be when we were all together. My mother's health became a concern around this time. She was diagnosed with high blood pressure and had to start taking medication. It was a reminder that she wasn't getting any younger and that the time Emma had with her grandmother was precious. I thought about all the years that David had stolen from them, all the memories that should have been made but weren't. The anger I felt toward him hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger. Every time I saw my mother struggle with her health, I thought about how David's selfishness had robbed her of years with her granddaughter. Those were years we could never get back. Emma's middle school years brought typical adolescent challenges, compounded by the divorce. She became moodier and more withdrawn. She spent hours in her room with the door closed. When I tried to talk to her about what was going on, she would shrug and say everything was fine, but I could see that everything was not fine. Her grades started slipping again. She stopped participating in activities she used to enjoy. I took her back to counseling, hoping that talking to a professional would help her work through whatever she was dealing with. The therapist suggested that Emma was experiencing delayed grief over the divorce, that she was finally processing feelings she had pushed down when she was younger. David and Rachel got engaged, and Emma came home from a weekend visit with the news. She seemed conflicted about it. Part of her was happy for her father, but another part of her seemed troubled. When I asked her how she felt about it, she admitted that she didn't know. She liked Rachel well enough, but the engagement made everything feel more permanent. It meant that her parents were never getting back together, a fantasy that apparently she had been holding on to despite all the years that had passed. I held her while she cried, and I tried to reassure her that it was okay to have complicated feelings about the situation. I told her that David's new marriage didn't change how much he loved her or how much I loved her. The wedding happened 6 months later. Emma was invited and chose to attend. I spent that day trying to keep myself busy so I wouldn't think about what was happening. My mother came over and kept me company. We baked cookies and watched movies, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept wondering what Emma was experiencing. Was she okay? Was Rachel treating her well? Was David finally happy? And underneath all of that was a deeper question. Had he told Rachel the truth yet, or was he building another marriage on lies? Emma came home from the wedding quiet and thoughtful. When I asked her how it went, she said it was nice. David had asked her to be part of the ceremony, and she had felt special standing up there with them. But she also said something that broke my heart. She said she wished things could have been different. She wished our family could have stayed together. I explained to her as gently as I could that sometimes staying together isn't the healthy choice, that sometimes parents love their children enough to make hard decisions, even when those decisions cause pain. I don't know if she understood what I was trying to say, but I hoped that someday she would. My own mother's health continued to decline slowly. Nothing catastrophic, just the gradual wearing down that comes with age. She tired more easily. She had aches and pains that never quite went away. I found myself thinking about mortality in a way I never had before. My mother wouldn't be here forever. Emma needed to have as much time with her as possible. Every visit, every phone call, every shared meal felt more precious. I was so grateful that the last few years had allowed them to build a real relationship, even if it had come later than it should have. David's career took an unexpected turn when his company downsized and he lost his job. This happened about a year after his wedding to Rachel. Suddenly, the child support payments became even more irregular. He claimed he simply didn't have the money to pay what the court had ordered. I had to take him back to court to enforce the agreement, which meant more lawyer fees and more stress. The judge ultimately reduced the payment amount temporarily until David found new employment, which left me scrambling to cover the shortfall in our budget. It felt like I was being punished for his professional failures, and I resented it deeply. Emma was now 12 years old and starting to ask more direct questions about why her father and I had divorced. She wasn't satisfied with vague answers anymore. She wanted specifics. I knew the time was coming when I would have to tell her the truth about David's past, but I kept putting it off. How do you tell your child that their father is a criminal? How do you explain fraud and deception and identity theft to a 12-year-old? I consulted with her therapist, who suggested that Emma was mature enough to handle an honest conversation, but that I should frame it carefully. The therapist offered to be present when I told her to help her process the information. We scheduled a special session with Emma's therapist, and I told her the truth. I explained that before I met her father, he had been involved in some very bad choices, that he had hurt people and had gone to jail for it, that when he moved to California, he had legally changed his name and had never told me about any of this. I explained that I had only found out years into our marriage and that the lying more than anything else was why I had decided to divorce him. Emma's reaction was not what I expected. She was angry, but not at David. She was angry at me. She accused me of keeping this huge secret from her. She said I had lied to her too by not telling her sooner. She stormed out of the therapy session and refused to talk to me for days. That was one of the darkest periods after the divorce. Emma was furious with me. She spent more time at David's house than at mine, using the custody arrangement flexibility to avoid me as much as possible. When she was home, she was cold and distant. I tried to give her space while also letting her know I was there whenever she was ready to talk. It took weeks before she finally came to me and asked more questions. She wanted to know exactly what David had done, who he had hurt, and why he had kept it secret. I answered every question as honestly as I could. Gradually, she began to understand why I had made the choices I did. But our relationship had been damaged, and it would take time to repair. David was furious when he found out I had told Emma about his past. He accused me of poisoning her against him. He said I had no right to share that information without his permission. We had a heated argument over the phone, one of the worst we had ever had. I told him that Emma had a right to know the truth about her own father, that I had waited as long as I could, but she was asking questions and deserved honest answers. He threatened to take me back to court for violating some imaginary agreement we had never made. His lawyer eventually talked him down, pointing out that there was no court order preventing me from telling Emma the truth about his criminal history. Emma's relationship with David became strained after she learned about his past. She started asking him questions he didn't want to answer. She demanded to know why he had lied to me and why he had kept her away from her grandmother. David tried to minimize what he had done, saying it was all in the past and that he had changed. But Emma was old enough now to understand the implications. She understood that her father had deliberately hurt vulnerable people. She understood that he had built his entire relationship with me on lies. And she understood that his actions had consequences that rippled through the whole family. Her respect for him was damaged, and no amount of explaining or apologizing seemed to help. Rachel eventually learned the truth about David's past as well. I wasn't the one who told her. Emma did. During a difficult conversation at David's house, Emma blurted out everything she had learned. Rachel was shocked. She confronted David, and according to Emma, they had a massive fight. Rachel moved out for a few weeks while she processed the information. I felt a complicated sense of vindication mixed with sympathy. This woman was going through the same betrayal I had experienced years earlier. Eventually, Rachel moved back in and decided to stay with David, but their marriage had clearly been shaken. Trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild. As Emma entered her teenage years, she became increasingly outspoken about her feelings regarding the divorce and her father's actions. She wrote about it in school essays. She talked about it with her friends. She even created social media posts alluding to family trauma without naming names. David was embarrassed and asked me to make her stop. I told him that Emma had a right to her own feelings and her own story, that if he didn't like what she was saying, maybe he should reflect on the choices that led to those feelings. He accused me of encouraging her to hate him, which wasn't true. I never spoke badly about David to Emma. I didn't have to. She had formed her own opinions based on the facts. My mother's health took a serious turn when she had a minor stroke. She recovered most of her function, but it was a frightening reminder of how fragile life is. Emma spent every moment she could at her grandmother's side during the recovery period. Their bond had grown incredibly strong over the years since the divorce. My mother often told me how grateful she was that they had been able to build such a close relationship, even though it came later than it should have. She never blamed me for the years that were lost. She only focused on the years they had gained. That grace and forgiveness meant everything to me. Emma is now 15 years old, and she's thriving despite everything. She's smart, compassionate, and resilient. She's learned hard lessons about trust and honesty at a younger age than most kids. She knows that people aren't always who they seem to be, and that even those we love can disappoint us deeply. But she's also learned that it's possible to survive betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. She tells me that watching me rebuild my life after the divorce has taught her that she doesn't need anyone else to be complete. That she can stand on her own 2 feet no matter what life throws at her. I'm proud of the woman Emma is becoming, but I'm also sad about what she's had to endure to get here. No child should have to learn about fraud and deception and criminal history when they're trying to navigate middle school. No child should have to split holidays and shuttle between houses and manage complicated feelings about their father's past. But this is the reality we live in because of David's choices and because of my decision to leave when I discovered the truth. I still believe I made the right choice, but that doesn't mean I don't wish things could have been different. Looking back over the past 7 years since the divorce, I can see how much has changed. I'm not the same person I was when I walked into that investigator's office and learned the truth about my husband. I'm stronger now, more cautious, but also more certain of my own judgment. I've learned to trust my instincts, to ask questions when something doesn't feel right, to demand honesty in all my relationships. I've learned that sometimes love isn't enough, that you need trust and respect and transparency to build a life with someone. Without those things, even the deepest love will eventually crumble. My mother often tells me that she's proud of me for having the courage to leave. She says many women would have stayed, would have convinced themselves that the past didn't matter or that they could live with the lies. But I couldn't do that. I couldn't model that kind of acceptance for Emma. I couldn't spend the rest of my life wondering what other secrets David was keeping. I couldn't look at my mother, knowing that my husband had specifically targeted people like her in his criminal past. The choice to leave was painful, but it was the only choice that allowed me to maintain my integrity and protect my family. David and I are civil now, mostly for Emma's sake. We can have conversations about her schedule and her needs without fighting. But there's no warmth there, no friendship. We're co-parents and nothing more. He's still with Rachel, and they seem to have worked through the crisis his lies created in their marriage. I hope for Emma's sake that he's finally learned his lesson, that he's being honest with Rachel in ways he never was with me. But I don't know for sure, and it's not my problem anymore. My only concern is Emma's well-being and making sure she has the support she needs to navigate her relationship with her father. I still haven't dated seriously since the divorce. There have been a few casual coffee dates, a few attempts that went nowhere. The truth is, I'm not sure I'm capable of trusting someone enough to build a real relationship with them. The damage David did goes deeper than I sometimes want to admit. My therapist says that with time and continued work, I'll be able to open my heart again. But right now, I'm comfortable being alone. I have Emma, I have my mother, I have my sister and my friends. That's enough. Maybe someday I'll be ready for more, but there's no rush. I'd rather be happily single than miserably attached to someone who isn't being honest with me. The financial situation has slowly stabilized over the years. I got that promotion I had been working toward just a few years later than originally planned. David found new employment and is back to paying regular child support. We're not wealthy by any means, but we're secure. Emma and I live in a comfortable home, and we can afford the things she needs. My mother is still living independently, though I know that may change as she continues to age. I try to prepare myself for what's coming, for the inevitable decline and eventual loss, but it's hard to think about. She's been my rock through all of this, and I can't imagine navigating life without her. Emma talks about college now. about her dreams for the future. She wants to study psychology, maybe become a therapist herself. She says she wants to help other kids who are dealing with family trauma and divorce. I think she'll be amazing at it. She has empathy and insight beyond her years. She's lived through experiences that have given her wisdom most adults don't have. If any good has come from this terrible situation, it's that Emma has developed strength and resilience that will serve her well throughout her life. She knows how to survive hard things. She knows how to ask for help when she needs it. She knows that honesty matters more than almost anything else. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if David had just told me the truth from the beginning. What if, when we first started dating, he had sat me down and explained his past? Would I have given him a chance? I honestly don't know. Maybe I would have been scared off by the revelation of his criminal history. Maybe I would have decided the risk wasn't worth it. But maybe I would have appreciated his honesty and given him the opportunity to prove he had changed. We'll never know, because he chose deception over truth. He chose to build our relationship on a foundation of lies, and that foundation could never support the weight of a real marriage. The hardest part of all of this is knowing that Emma is caught in the middle of something she never asked to be part of. She loves both of her parents, despite everything. She wants to believe the best about her father, but she also knows the truth about what he did. She's working through that contradiction with her therapist, trying to find a way to maintain a relationship with him while also protecting herself. It's a delicate balance, and some days are harder than others, but she's managing, and I'm so proud of her for that. Please tell me in the comment section if I was right or wrong to divorce my husband, because this decision didn't just end her honeymoon early. It cost her the husband she loved, turned our parents against me, and left our family so fractured that my own children haven't spoken to their cousins in 2 years. And I'm sure she won't be inviting me to her next family event this year.